Good evening, everyone. We're going to start by calling this meeting to order. This is our regularly scheduled meeting for the Energy Consumers Advisories Committee. Tonight is March 4th, 2013. I'm Lupe Ramos-Watson, your chairwoman. We will start with call to order and roll call, please.
Good evening. I'm going to do roll call here in La Quinta for both areas, so please make sure you turn on your microphones when you say present. Mr. Larson?
Present.
Mr. Abadi?
I love you, man.
Mr. Hickenbottom?
Present.
Mr. Perez?
Here. Thanks. Here.
Mr. Nunez?
Present.
Mr. Hernandez?
Present.
Ms. Anderson? Mr. Anderson? Michael? Ms. Gomez?
Present. Mr. Anderson is also present.
Thank you. Mr. Weber?
Present. Present.
Mr. Osborne?
Here.
Mr. McNicky?
Present.
Mr. Garcia?
Present.
Ms. Kay? Ms. Ramos-Watson?
Present.
Ms. Broughton?
Present.
Ms. Soleil? Mr. Bayard?
Present.
And Mr. Gibson.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. If you would please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Item number 2, approval of the minutes. We have in our packet the minutes of February 4th, 2013. Are there any additions, revisions, or corrections? Vice Chair Gomez, do we have any in Imperial County?
No, none.
Are there any in Coachella Valley?
One just modification I mentioned to the coordinator on page 2 of the minutes from February 4th. I think there was just a typo, and I believe that, Marion, you'd checked it, and we kind of both agreed that the very first sentence there, the plant would be using a monocrystalline or a monocrystalline silicon single tracking system is what the Soul Orchard folks are doing. So I think just wanted to make sure it was clarified there.
Yes, and that is what the audio recording did reflect.
Are there any other revisions or corrections?
So I'll make a motion, if that's the last one, to for approval of the minutes as amended.
Second.
We have a motion and a second here in Coachella Valley. Is there
Let the record reflect one abstention, City of Coachella.
any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries with the one abstention from the City of Coachella.
I also need to abstain. I wasn't present.
2 abstentions. Am I echoing in Imperial County?
No, you're not. We can hear you
Okay.
well.
Thank you. Moving on to item number 3, public comment. This is the time set aside for any member of the public wishing to address the committee to please make themselves known. Please step forward to the podium and state your name. Vice Chair Gomez, is there anyone in Imperial County stepping forward?
No, none in Imperial County.
Thank you. There is no one stepping forward in Coachella Valley, so I will close the public comment period and move on to item number 4, system update. Mr. Escalera, you have a report this evening?
Thank you, Madam President. Mario Escalera, Energy Operations and Energy Infrastructure Manager. I would just like to have just some very quick updates on the system. The system so far has performed as expected. We've had minimal outages for the past first quarter. Just a few updates on some of the things that we're working on and we'll be bringing forward is on some ongoing initiatives and public outreaches that we have. As you're aware, we're very keen on our copper thefts. We have finalized our program. We have established a speakers group that's comprised of managers from our operations and distributions section. These managers are being scheduled as time permits, and we're allowed to speak and present to the various public agencies and public and private groups in seeking their assistance and providing them information on how they can assist us in reducing copper theft. Also, we're in the final stages of our graffiti abatement program. We recognize that that's an ongoing problem, not only to us, but all of the cities. In an effort to make sure that we keep our good neighbor status, we've revamped our system. We're kind of hopefully have that come back to present to the ECAC in a couple of months. And it'll be kind of following the same type of format that our copper theft is. We'll outreach, and then we're identifying some resources that may assist us in combating graffiti, because it really is just rampant. As the ECAC will recall, early last year, we made a presentation on our revamped circuit inspection and patrolling that's done by our troubleshooters. We presented a GIS format that we were starting to use using our new Toughbooks laptops. As we've now had that for a good 9 months, just as an example of the success that we've had. Just as a little backdrop, the inspection uses GEO 95, GEO 128, and GEO 165 as a backdrop as to what they use to inspect beyond other things that we inspect for. We've inspected over 40,000 structures. That represents about 30% of our assets and there of those, and I'm going to give you just La Quinta data, since we're in La Quinta, and I'm going to present the data for Imperial Valley next time we meet down there. In Imperial, of the 20,000, in La Quinta, of the 20,000 structures that we've inspected, 10,000 needed some type of corrective action. Of those, 4 what we refer to as critical, and an additional 208 needed some high priority repairs. Those have already been completed. To give you an example, anything is correct. If there's a sign missing, a strip of reflective strip is missing, that's a corrective action. That's why you see so many. As we said, we'll present some of that data in more detail, hopefully next month, for the Imperial Group. As an overall comparison, how well our efforts have done through the foresight of not only just the ECAC, but the board, in allowing and having enough resources to do the job that we need to do. If we were to take the reliability or just the outages that we've had comparing 2011 to 2012, we've had a decrease of about 18% of outages between 2011 and 2012, from 900 plus to about 700 plus last year. We project that we're going to have an additional percentage of reduction for this year. Just as an example, this time last year we had 170 recorded outages. We're at 110. So we're vastly improving, and I think that is a reflection of the funding and the resources that we've been allowed to implement into the system. With that concludes my very, very short system update. Unless somebody has some very specific questions, I'd be more than glad to address them.
Thank you, Mr. Escalera. Would you please share with the committee the schedule for the outreach so that we can disseminate that information to our respective areas?
I don't have the schedule with me, but I'll have Marion send that out to you, and that includes all of the outreaches that we have, and it'll also have the presenters.
Thank you. Vice Chair Gomez, do we have any questions in Imperial County?
Yes, Mr. Hernandez.
How you doing, Mario?
Good, thank you, sir.
John Hernandez. A couple questions. You said structures. What exactly do you mean by structures, and maybe a couple examples so I can understand.
A power pole is a structure. A transformer a switch, anything that is a physical asset is what we refer to as a structure. So it can be something relatively small, as a small underground transformer you see on some of these neighborhoods, to a large pole.
And
But
of
most of these are all, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And of these structures, what are the major structures that we see or have identified problems with? Is there like a group of structures that are the ones that always need the most attention?
Well, and realizing, Mr. Hernandez, that you weren't here when we made the presentation, and if I may, is what the inspection or patrolling works in is our troubleshooters, which are our first responders, have a laptop, and in there we've established an inspection program. We use GIS as the basis for that program. All of our structures, our poles, our transformers, even the meters in your house, we've established coordinates on there. So as the troubleshooter is making their patrols for that particular circuit, as he comes up to a power pole, it automatically brings up information on that power pole, and then there's a series of questions that it asks. It asks the condition of the pole. It asks if there's any damage, or all various, depending on what he's looking for, is all of the warning signs on there, are the groundings there, and so he marks off what's there or what isn't on there. And as soon as he does that, he drives on to the next power pole.
Okay, so
and
this
it's
is
basically a transmission.
So this is a report that you provide to us on a quarterly basis, yearly basis, and you did it sometime last year at one of these meetings? That way, if I can get a date, I can go back and review it.
It was really more of a presentation. The report itself is an internal document. We use it to assign resources, budgeting purposes, schedule crews, and so on. It really gives the managers a view of what's out in the field and the condition of the assets. And so we plan whether to be a reactive type of action or a proactive type of action.
Okay.
So it's not something that we, but what we try to do is we're hoping as a year progresses and we get a full year, is maybe come back to the ACAC and give you a summary, kind of what we did today, but in more detail.
Okay, I'm just trying to get an understanding. And then the other question I have is, I've noticed on Dogwood and Commercial over there by the plant on Dogwood and Villa, there's a lot of equipment there laying around, I guess, that's probably being used for something and or is no longer being used for something. What's going on with that material there in that area?
Mr. Hernandez, is that over there is that the steam plant you're referring to in
Yes.
that fenced-in area
Yes.
where our plant is? Some of that is storage area, depending on which one you're referring to. There's an area that we call Area 51, which is material that's relatively new, and we use it for as our inventory in case of an emergency. There's also an area that we keep as when we go into a substation or an area that we replace something. If some of that is still in good condition, we will keep that, particularly if there's another asset similar to it. In other words, if we take out a transformer and there's another particular transformer like that in our system, what we'll do is the one that we're replacing, we'll refurbish it and we'll store it there in case we ever need it. So what you have is really just storage. And some of it is just things that we've taken out and we haven't got to just yet, is going through as far as should we keep or throw out. Our
Right.
guys don't like to get rid of anything.
All right, thank you.
But that's what you see. It's just storage.
Any further questions in Imperial County?
No additional questions or comments.
Thank you. Do we have any questions of Mr. Escalera in Coachella Valley? Seeing none, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
your report. Moving on to item number 5, legislative update, Mr. Ortega.
Antonio Ortega, Government Affairs ID. Good evening, committee members. About the same time last year, I provided you all with an update on the 2012 legislative platform. This year, given that there's a new start of a new 2-year legislative session, we have made some changes to our legislative platform for 2013. And in your packet, you have the full 6-page document And what I will do is just go over some of the more important changes. About half of the items that were on the 2012 platform were kept on this year's platform just because they are issues that continue to come up in either Washington or Sacramento. But there are also some additional items that we've added. And again, what I will do is go through only those on the energy side of the operations for IID. But if you review the document, you will see that we have separated into energy, water issues, but also overall issues that may not fall into one or the other, but are still important to IID. If you have any questions at any time, just feel free to interrupt me. So starting with the federal legislative priorities, and just as a refresher, and for those of you, I see some new faces that were not here before, a legislative platform essentially is just a tool that we will use to allow our representatives, not only in Washington, but also in Sacramento, and our contract lobbyists specifically, to use this as a guide and when they are lobbying our representatives, to know what those issues are of priority to the district. So this, again, serves as a guide for them, but also for us here internally. So as we comb through bills that come before the state or the federal government, then we are all looking at the same priority issues. So on the federal legislative priorities, first is balancing authority, and again, that is just something that comes up not only at the state level but also at the federal level. So you will see that that bullet is included in both, and that is essentially the protection of IID's balancing authority area and ensuring that we are not lumped together with Cal ISO or with others. Cybersecurity, this is something that for the past 2 years has been a hot topic or a hot button item in Washington. Recently, there was a request by congressional staff on behalf of other public utilities to provide them with information about our cybersecurity measures. So that is an issue that we will continue to monitor. And if there are any legislative proposals that come from this, we will have to take this back to the board and take some type of action or positions. Yes. Correct. And Carl Stills just reminded me that.
What was the question? I'm sorry, the mic wasn't on.
It's just a comment that Mr. Ortega is going to include in his presentation. He'll repeat it right now.
Yeah, so Carl Stills just reminded me that we did receive a formal request from Congress members Waxman and Markey. They are both members of the House Energy Committee, for information regarding IID's internal policies and regulations for protection of our system and cybersecurity measures. So we have provided a formal response to those members as of 2 weeks ago when they submitted that request or their deadline. So moving on, we have San Juan Generation Station. This is a generation unit in the state of New Mexico that IID is a owner of one of their facilities. So we are keeping track or tracking some issues there, some settlement agreements with the state of New Mexico and federal EPA. Again, I don't want to get down into some of the details, but I have a bullet point there that just gives you a general description as to why we are tracking this. Hydroelectric power and generation, this is something important to the district. There is currently a process for allocation of Hoover power, and although we have not yet applied for this power, this is something that IID Energy Department is considering, and we are going to move forward with when that time comes and when the federal government asks us to submit our applications or our request. Also, on that same bullet, hydroelectric facilities. Currently, small hydro, which is, large hydro, anything over 30 megawatts, is not included in the state's RPS and is not allowed to be counted as green energy. So here we will continue to support any measures that would allow that to be counted, because in my opinion, and those and others in the energy sector, that should be counted.
Excuse me, a question in that respect then. So what is included in the RPS and what is not included in the RPS? Is that a federal issue or a state issue?
Well, that is a state issue, but if the federal government were to allow that, then it would trump the state RPS. So they do have that authority to do so, but most of the RPS, as you will see in the next 2 pages, falls under the state RPS guidelines.
That's what I saw. Okay. So, forgive me. So where do we stand on trying to get hydroelectricity included in that RPS?
Well, at the state level, at the federal level, there really isn't something now. There isn't any legislation that is proposing to make that change. But on the state side, there was recently a bill by a senator that was introduced that would increase that threshold. And he did this last year, and the bill was not even heard in committee, but he is trying again.
Is there any specific reason why they won't bring it out of committee?
Well, I think some of the opposition from the environmental community is what we heard from the author as being the primary concern, but there are those others in the state, including the CEC and some of their staff, that I don't know if they're on the same thinking that we are, and this is not a subject that they, or a regulation that they seem to be willing to modify, but if they were told to do so by the legislature, then they would have to abide by those rules.
Okay, thank you.
So moving on, renewable energy tax incentives, again, supporting anything that would establish or extend financial tax incentives for any of the renewable energy industry, solar, geothermal, wind. So this is not specific to any one industry. And then finally, any issues regarding transmission rights-of-ways. And then Water Department, again, I will skip that section. Overall organization, I will skip those as well and move on to the...
Antonio?
Yes.
I noticed you must have skipped the West Chocolate Mountains on the first page.
Yes.
And
Sorry.
since that affects us up here.
Correct, and I apologize for that. There's the West Chocolate Mountains Renewable Energy Evaluation Area, so REEA. This has been an ongoing process by, I believe it's the BLM folks. For about 2 years, they have studied a region or a portion of the West Chocolate Mountains for streamlined potential development in that area for solar and also for wind energy development in that site. Currently, I believe they are in the reviewing their EIS, EIR. So that is as much as I've tracked it as of this past month when I put this document together.
Just one follow-up on that. That isn't within the transmission area of IED?
It's within the power generation service area. So do we have transmission? I couldn't answer that.
Yeah,
but
there's that one line, right, that comes down. Yeah, doesn't it come through there?
Yeah, I think the index was up by the Navy probably about 2015.
So I guess what I'm trying to get at is I assume that any generation that would be put on in that area, if this exploratory zone, comes to fruition, would have to go through the IED, have to be interconnected through IED and through the IED transmission, and therefore
That's correct.
Right,
Yeah,
okay.
final.
Okay.
Did Imperial County understand that comment? Mr. Ortega, would you recap what was just said?
Yeah, so Mr. Weber asked about transmission in the West Chocolate Mountains region and if IID has current transmission infrastructure in that region, and the answer is yes. And as we move forward and as this process develops, we will continue to monitor this issue, and if there is potential growth in that area or siting of any renewable energy projects, then they would have to come to IID and ask for either permitting or infrastructure upgrades.
In the event, Mario, Antonio, they were to approve solar, wind energy, or something like that, would IID get any credit for RPS standards for California?
Well, if they are selling to IID, then the answer would be yes.
Okay.
But if for some reason they would not do so and bypass us, as is the case in Imperial County with some of the solar development, then the answer would be no. Okay, so if there are no questions, then under the state legislative priorities, I will only touch on those that I have not already done so on the federal side. And the big one for the state of California is the RPS. And this is something that continues to evolve. Every year there's at least a handful of bills that try to modify some of the requirements. We had heard earlier in the year that there was potential legislation to increase the RPS from the current 33% for 2020, but that has not occurred unless a member will amend one of their bills. The deadline to introduce all bills was on the 22nd of last month. So again, right now, for 2013, there is no increase in the state's RPS. But that can always change, and as you all have seen with the legislative session as it develops, I will be back before you to give you a quarterly update with any bills that the IID board takes a position on, and if an RPS bill were to come up, then that is something that we will definitely track and update you with. So in all those bullets, again, it's essentially tracking any potential changes to the RPS, and there I included the large hydropower, 30 megawatts and above. The balancing authority, we've already spoke about that. Renewable energy auction, the RAM program. This is a current regulations or a program under the CPUC. And we actually, the Energy Department and IID has submitted support comments to continue this program for projects that develop within the IID's balancing authority area. Resource adequacy, this is an issue that has spilled over from last year. There was a commissioner ruling on behalf of the PUC regarding RA capacity, and again, that is an issue that we continue to track as the year moves forward. Station service, I had provided the ECAC with an update on this issue back in maybe the summer, but this is an issue that we continue to pursue. If somebody, again, if I don't want to take up more time, but if you want me to get into the weeds of it, if not, I can provide you. I believe we had sent a memo to the ECAC just informing you what this issue is. I can recirculate that for those of you that are new on the board. Greenhouse gas emissions, public goods charge, net energy metering, solar program, again, the tax incentives, transmission rights of way. I would rather open it up for any questions than me to go through all these again. You have them there in your packet.
Thank you, Mr. Ortega. Would you please circulate to the committee members the 2013 in platform in electronic form so we can have that at our disposal to share?
Okay.
Are there any questions, Chairwoman or Gomez, in Imperial County?
I'm sorry, no questions from Mill Central.
Thank you. Are there any questions in Coachella Valley? Mr. Osborne.
Going back to that hydroelectricity issue, I would think that all the power companies and consumers would want that be included in the RPS to reduce the cost of the RPS. Is this particular California Assemblyman or Senator, are they getting much backing with utility companies to help bring along that bill?
Well, I can only speak to last year's bill because, again, this bill for this year has not yet been vetted by any policy committees. But as a member of the, IID is a member of the California Municipal Utilities Association, CMUA for short, and we, as a membership association, we did support Senator Canella's bill, and he's out of the Central Valley region. But again, unfortunately, the bill was not even heard in its policy committee, so there really wasn't an opportunity to engage the utility folks. But with his revised version of that bill this year, there may be an opportunity to do so. So again, that's as much as I know in terms of the support from the other members.
And the environmentalists are the ones opposing this aspect?
Well, they did last year, and I'm assuming that they will most likely oppose again this year.
They don't like dams?
No.
They don't like hydroelectricity, as green as that is?
They just don't want it, it's already in the mix, and they just don't want utilities to get credit for it. They want to push the RPS to push the Encore.
But it is green.
Well, it's green. I mean, I agree, but I would think that the issue is that they already have it in the mix. They already feel it's already there. It's already been paid for, and so they want to push the RPS as far as they possibly can to get more hydro, and they don't want to take credit for something that's already existing.
Well, and then
correct, and it would be
the price of the RPS as much as they can to
They don't
higher
care
the
about
cost
the
of
cost.
power, the less we'll use, I guess.
I would think
Yeah, so the RPS, the argument made by staff at the policy committee levels is also that the RPS was created for new development, not to credit development that's already there and is not currently counted.
So much for the economies of it. Thank you.
Mr. Weber.
Let's see. First off, I would be remiss if I didn't note the overall organization supporting enterprise zones. I thought that was great.
Yes.
On the economic development front, under the overall organization, I did notice the Calexico Port of Entry, so supporting that to help with the economic development side of things, because that's obviously important to growing the community, to helping us with the job situation here, as well as that joint strike fighter down there at the Naval Air Facility in Imperial County. Is that, can you kind of just add a little bit to that? I was intrigued to see that down there. How likely is that as a possibility?
Well, yeah, so on the enterprise zone front, as for those of you that may not be aware, IID is a member of the JPA that comprises both the Imperial County Enterprise Zone, Calexico Enterprise Zone, and also the Coachella Valley Enterprise Zone. So, yes, I mean, that was important to include in the platform.
Well, just
in terms of the strike
just a
force,
correction, they're not part of the JPA for the Coachella Valley one, but they are for the two down in Imperial County.
Okay. My apologies.
But they're partners.
Yes, but we continue to be partners, yes. So for the Strike Fighter Coalition, the only update is that as of last Friday, there has been a document released, the EIS, EIR document, where the two stations that are being seen as potential siting locations, Lemoore in Northern California and NAF in El Centro, the preferred location, according to the document, is the Lemoore station. So that's bad news for the locals, but that also means that now is the time to re-engage with our elected officials and with the community at large and do a call to action and hopefully persuade them to reconsider.
Yeah, hopefully the chambers down there and the cities are taking that as a call to action, like you said, because that could be a tremendous economic driver, to that area. So that's great. Thank you.
Are there any further questions in Coachella Valley? Thank you very much, Mr. Ortega. Thank you for the report. Moving on to item number 6, we have an ECA rate change. Ms. Ainsworth, we also have on our dais a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. I hope everyone in Imperial has that.
Good evening, Sandra Ainsworth, Finance Department, and I have a brief update for you on the status of the current rate action that is in front of the Board of Directors with the ECA. I know there are some new members, so I just want to go ahead and define the energy cost adjustment charge, just in case anyone's not familiar with that. The energy cost adjustment rate is the portion of the consumer's bill from IID that allows IID to collect for and pass through to the customers our power supply cost. Excuse me, with the exception of capacity cost, premium cost, and the falling water charge, as those are assumed to be in the base rate. And why that is important to IID is that approximately 75% of our annual operating budget is power supply costs. So a small fluctuation in the cost of power or gas can really impact our budget. So that allows us to be more flexible to pass costs through as we see fluctuations occurring, as opposed to having to go for rate hearings. So what we're currently looking at doing is we're currently proposing to actually change the rate structure slightly, and that's why we've got public hearings going before the public. So a quick overview, I'll talk a little bit about the status of the 2013 budget process, the approval of that budget. The last time I was before this group was actually presenting the proposed budget and the proposed rate action that we have before us. I'll review very briefly both the current and the proposed rate schedules with the current ECA rate formula and the proposed rate formula, in addition to a quick overview of the definitions of the component costs of the ECA, in addition to showing you that with the change, were it to be implemented and approved by the board, the structure change, what we project the ECA rate would be, the monthly rates would be in 2013, in addition to a very high-level financial forecast. So we've had a couple of budget workshops back in November and December, and excuse me, part of those workshops are included in the financial figures that were presented to the board in those workshops. There was an assumed 1 cent base rate increase that was proposed, and that's in fact what I discussed with this group the last time I was in front of you. So in going through these budget workshops, a few questions surfaced and got us rethinking and taking a look at how could we accommodate for the renewable portfolio standards that we have in place, and that is 20% for 2013. Thank you. And while mitigating the cost impact to our customers, in addition to being able to refund the overcollection balance that we have for the ECA, which is currently at $36 million. And we also have the rate stabilization fund. Those funds have been restricted by the board, must be approved, must be approved by the board, and that current balance is $100 million. So we were considering all of that and trying to figure out what is the best way to proceed at this time with a rate action. So what we arrived at is, as opposed to actually proposing a 1 cent rate increase, that we would actually go in, take a look at the ECA rate structure, and that we could accomplish all of the points that I just mentioned on the previous slide by actually adjusting the ECA formula. Now, after this slide, I'm going to go into the components that are included. So I'll define this cost component of 0.99 cents a little bit further. But in the current ECA formula, there's the calculation is laid out. It's essentially cost, net revenues divided by sales. You come up with what we call the gross ECA rate, and once you've arrived at that, you give the customer an additional almost 1 cent credit. And what that cent represents is back in 2002, the last time that the ECA rate schedule was actually revised, those dollars represented some of the base cost other than the capacity premium, and falling water charges that are included in the base rate. So it was assumed there's an additional 1 cent being collected for in the base rate for power supply costs. However, as time has gone by, it's been almost 11 years, and we have not revised the base rate structure. What we actually see is that the current formula, including that credit, is no longer really representative of what our cost structure is. So we thought, let's go ahead and go in and revise the structure to more currently represent our current costs. And we're recommending that this rate change would be effective April 1st. All of our projections assume that implementation date. And what that would allow us to do is to fully utilize or refund back to the customers the $36.1 million balance that we have in the overcollection balance that was collected for years 10 and 11 through the ECA. In addition, we see that we could also utilize an additional $23 million from the rate stabilization fund, and doing those two things would allow us to actually maintain the current rate of 324 to the customer with having no financial impact to the customer in 2013, and still allowing us to meet the financial metrics that we need to do.
Question,
Yes.
if I could, Mr. Chairman. Regarding that ECA balance of $36 million.
Yes, sir.
So that, and forgive me for my ignorance, but that energy cost adjustment balance of $36 million, where did that $36 million come from?
That $36 million came from the customer. So back in 2011, the ECA rate was actually fixed at, started the year out at 5.01 cents, and then it was reduced effective July 1st of 2011 to 4.19 cents. So having those fixed ECA rates, we were able to beat the market. Gas costs have been remarkably low for the last couple of years, as have energy costs. In addition to, we didn't actually incur some of the renewable portfolio expenses that we anticipated. We started bringing those online in 2012. So a combination of those factors resulted in an overcollection from the customer.
So our costs went down, so we created this reserve, so to speak.
That's correct.
Because of our lower costs. Thank you.
Not only cost, but we also made some very smart purchases.
We did. We have a real-time trading floor that's been implemented in addition to keeping the day ahead, and the portfolio manager who's kept a very close eye on not only, we go out and we perform hedges and those types of things and secure future power supply, but as market prices have decreased, we've been able to capitalize on that and thereby reduce our total power supply cost.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So then just a real quick recap of what the actual published board-approved ESA formula is today, and that's represented on this slide. You have the presentation before you. And in a nutshell, it is essentially the F equals what the ECA rate is, the calculated rate, and that equals cost minus the cost component credit that we're talking about, the 0099 credit. And when you look at that and expand that, included in that is your retail energy costs, both gas, power supply, and all other costs, then plus or minus any current or prior period balancing account balance that you do have. In addition, we net out wholesale. So where load doesn't come in as anticipated and we've got excess gas or energy, we go back and remarket that, and then we net those revenues against the ECA calculation. So just again to recap, this last component, the B equals the cost component of energy. It's this, what currently represents really an artificial credit to the customer of almost 1 cent that we are proposing be eliminated.
I have a question.
Yes.
Under component cost of energy, what components are you talking about?
That is a term that in the rate schedule was actually defined. So it's defined as component cost of energy. And again, as I stated earlier, back in 2002, the last time the rate schedule was adjusted, it was assumed that
close to 1 cent of the power supply costs were being captured within the base rate collection. And so it's the terminology was decided at that point, but that's what that represents. But as I indicated, that's just no longer representative. We haven't had base rates since 1994, and costs, of course, continue to increase. So where that may have been representative in 2002, it no longer is the case.
Question.
And then just real quickly to give you an overview of the costs that are included in the ECA calculation. When we talk about power supply costs, we're talking about your cost of not only power that we purchase, but also natural gas, diesel, and diesel fuel that is required to run our internal generation units. In addition, as I indicated, that also covers energy and purchase power costs are also included, including transmission costs, which it takes to get the energy to us. It does exclude, as I indicated, capacity premiums for natural gas and purchase power, and canal space rental, which is the falling water charge. All of those charges or costs, rather, are collected for in the base rate, and that will continue to be so. In addition, the balancing account, that essentially represents any difference between ECA revenues and the ECA applicable cost. Projected revenue from wholesales is, I already discussed that. It's pretty straightforward. Anytime we not overprocure, but where load doesn't come in as anticipated, we have excess energy or gas, we go back and remarket that, sell that, and credit the revenues to the customers through the ECA. Then a component, the visor, essentially the denominator of the calculation, is retail kilowatt hour sales, and then the cost component of energy. So the revised schedule, what we're proposing is simply that the F, which is your ECA rate, equals your cost net of your wholesales and the other items that we talked about. We would eliminate the credit of the 0099 from the rate schedule. That is the change that we are proposing. So with that, I'm going to go into just a brief overview of the projected monthly ECA rate. So these figures assume that the elimination of that cost component, that 1 cent, would not be effective until April 1st. So what we see for these 6 months is that 4 of the 6 months, I'd like to point, is it this bottom one? I always mess it up. The top one. This one? So I'd just like to point out on the projector here that you'll see on this line item where it says ECA without funding offsets, you'll see that the figure is above 324, the current rate of 324 for 4 out of the 6 months. Then when we run that through to project what our status would be of either over or under collection of the ECA, what you can see is the numbers that are represented in red in parentheses show where we would be over collecting. I'm sorry, excuse me, under collecting from the customer. So we haven't collected enough revenues to cover our costs. So what I discussed earlier and what we are looking at is that in this last box that you'll see on your slide, actually showing you where we would bring in the funds from either the ECA over collection balance or the rate stabilization fund to actually be able to maintain the ECA rate at the current rate of 324. So there would be no effective increase to the customer in 2013. You'll see that there's all zeros on that bottom line at this point, use of the rate stabilization funds. And the reason for that is that we will first utilize completely the over collection of the ECA balance before we start using any of the rate stabilization funds. So our current projections, the next slide is the same thing, the same information, just for the months of July through December and annual totals. So we see still each of these months actually is projected to have an under collection. So what we see, or what our current projections show us, is that through the month of August we would be utilizing ECA over collection balance. Then about mid-August, the projections show that we would have fully utilized the full balance that's in there. At that point, we would go back to the board and on a monthly basis show them the amount that we need to transfer in from the rate stabilization fund to keep that ECA rate at 324, obtain their approval, which is required by board resolution, in order to utilize any of those funds. And we are projecting that we would utilize approximately $23 million from rate stabilization with current projections. Are there any questions on this slide before I move forward?
We have two here in Coachella Valley. Mr. Weber?
Sandra, I know a lot of complicated calculations have gone into this, and so I don't mean to go into the weeds on some of this, but when I look at the ECA rate without funding offsets, and I see the trend, and obviously in January it's under 3 cents, and then it's a little over 3 cents. It stays at 3 cents, and it peaks up during our peak load. And then it comes back down, and but then it also spikes in December. I guess my first question is, can you kind of shed a little bit of light on that? I mean, obviously, I would assume that is a product of the ECA power supply costs relative to the kilowatt hour sales.
That is actually correct. And on the first line item on the slide, what you'll see is the total net power supply cost. So you can see both the numerator and the denominator. The numerator in the calculation is your power supply cost, while the denominator is your kWh cells. So it is a function of that. And just to point something out, if it seems like an anomaly, the first year or two I was working with power supply costs, I thought it was an anomaly in December, but in December we have all the Christmas lights, and that really is a driver of pretty high load in the month of December for your off-peak season. So it pretty much every year it does jump up
and maybe
in December.
Electric heat, maybe in some areas that don't have gas, maybe? I don't know.
It could be.
Okay. Then... And so obviously we see how the projections goes out, and in December it's completely expended. So then obviously January of 2014 there's at least a 1 cent issue.
Not necessarily, because there is remember, there, in addition to the over-collection balance of $36 million, there's an additional $100 million sitting in the rate stabilization account that the board actually set aside specifically in the resolution. When they approved that, they called out for those funds to be used in the future to offset the impact of the renewable portfolio requirements.
Okay, so they put that aside as a prudent measure toward the risk that was unknown at that time.
That's correct.
Okay. One last question, since I have the mic right now. A general one. At some point, is there an effort to eventually reduce the ECA to where it effectively isn't such a large component of the overall rate, kilowatt hour effective rate, where it becomes more of just a delta from the staff's projection of the wholesale energy costs? So it becomes more of a fuel charge, just a fuel charge, and it could be an up or down. Is there ever, because right now we've got an ECA, which is a large portion of the total effective kilowatt hour rate. So for a residential customer at 2.9 cents a kilowatt hour, 3.2 cents of that is ECA, and the other balance is actually in the published rate. And I know sometimes there's an effort to have the majority of the cost to the consumer in the published rate, as opposed to some of it in the published rate and some of it in an energy cost adjustment or a fuel charge or whatever. Is there a push toward, at some point, reducing that ECA to where it becomes a smaller number and most of it's in the rate?
Well, I can tell you just very briefly, there has been a lot of discussion about the ECA over the last 7 or 8 years, and what is the best way to move forward with the structure. Which portion do we want to include in the base rate? And while I can't speak to the board's intent, the latest discussions that we've been having is that it's a good thing to have the flexibility to pass those any cost fluctuations for the power supply, since it is 75% or does represent 75% of our annual operating budget, to have that in the ECA and allow us more flexibility. In addition, a larger and larger portion of the power supply budget is going to be going towards covering the cost of renewables. So, for example, the actual renewable cost for 2012 were right at $33 million, while the projected figures for 2013 are $80 million. That's almost 3 times as much for that cost. And one thing the board has stipulated in the past, they've actually called this out and we've begun to do this, is that we create a separate component, break the ECA out rate out into 2 components, a non-renewable resource component and a renewable resource component. And I don't know if you've noticed, but that has been on the customer's bill since June of 2012. That way, we can actually show to the public what is driving these costs and what is driving the need for any potential increases in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's critical because the public, as Lee was kind of mentioning with the hydro, we're kind of getting at, the public needs to know the cost of the renewable portfolio standard and the cost of renewables. And while everyone wants to be green and hug a tree,
there is a cost to that.
There is a cost to it, and everyone needs to know what that cost is, so when they're making decisions and they're advocating for their positions, that they have full information to do it.
That's a very good point. And within the Energy Department, with the energy experts, we've kind of discussed the fact that unfortunately the voters have kind of been led down a road and they have not been notified of all the facts because, like you said, sure, it's great to be green, hug a tree, and all that good stuff, but there is a cost, and it is going to be a considerable cost.
Thank you.
Councilmember Osborne.
Thank you. So the use of these 2 funds totaling some $59 million, is that going to have any detrimental effect to other reserves, like your capital reserves or your operating reserves?
The answer is no. Those funds are both actually set aside specifically for the ECA.
Okay, so there won't be any reduction in services with this office here in
Not as a
Coachella
result
Valley?
of this action.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions in Coachella Valley? Hearing none, thank you, Ms. Ainsworth. You have a staff recommendation you ask us to
Ms. Ramos
recommend to
Watson?
the Board of Directors. Yes.
Would you have a question or comment
ahead.
from Mr. Hernandez?
I have a question. Again, I heard, just in round figures, we're looking at about 60 million with the 36 and the 23, or 59. And then we have another 100 million, of which the 23 is coming from. So 59 and 59 and 59 kind of washes all these funds out if we went that way in 2 years. So I guess what I'm hearing is that this formula is obsolete. The overcollection is obsolete, but the rates, we're still looking at raising rates in perhaps 2.5 years if we went with this formula. And in seeing what's happening across the country, where either you raise taxes or cut spending, in this organization we raise rates or cut costs. So when and how do we get to the point where we start being on the plus side and not blame the renewables for us going into the minus side? Is there any projections into how long it's going to take us to start seeing a positive from the standards that we have to meet on the renewables? Is there any light at the end of this tunnel, or are we just going to talk about raising rates in order to balance the books?
Well, I do want to make a couple of comments. And first of all, I do want to let you know that the Energy Department seeing these pressures and knowing they were coming, these cost pressures from renewables, have actually reduced our budget and spending over the last several subsequent years. Now, when it comes to the power supply costs, as you heard Mr. Ortega say, and there's probably been some discussion in the past, the state and federal are actually looking at increasing the minimum amount of requirement, not decreasing that. So we have gone out, we have a really good strategy in place. Ms. Belen Valenzuela, who is the Assistant Manager of Resource Planning, doing a great job of mitigating power supply cost. But at the end of the day, there's only so far down that we can push those costs.
Let me say something. There are some strategies that Senator doesn't know about because I haven't had a chance to share them with him because they haven't been developed yet. But as to your question, Mr. Hernandez, one of the things that we're looking at, if you can't cut costs, you have to get more product out of your existing assets. So to the extent that we can leverage the assets that we have and sell into another market where we might be able to get marginal cost to the point that's creating another revenue stream, we're going to be looking at that. One of the things that I want to do, and I've brought Frank Barbera back as a consultant to help us develop some strategies here. And we're looking at maximizing our generation assets. We're going to be looking at what our high cost is, how we can minimize that cost, how we can potentially sell into the imbalance market that we think is going to be out there, which will create more revenue streams, which could offset some of these costs. But those are strategies that we're just now working on. So we're going to be looking at that.
And that was going to be, if I can, that was going to be my question later. I mean, should some of these funds be used to update our equipment, to have more efficient production of energy, like the turbine that you guys put in place?
To the extent that we can put cheaper generation in place where our costs are sunk, we don't have fixed costs, it's just a variable cost, and then I could take that variable cost and sell it into another market that we can create a revenue stream off that, we'll look at that. We'll look at how do we actually market our transmission to a greater extent than we're doing now. So we're going to be developing some transmission and generation strategies that we don't currently have in place.
Thank you.
Mr. Hernandez, does that answer your question?
No, but I'll accept the explanation for this time.
Okay, well, it's a continuing discussion and
We do
continuing
have a
development
question
of
from
strategies.
Mr. Larson. Ms. Watson.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have I have a concern. I'm amazed that we're thinking about taking $60 million out of savings accounts to balance our budget. I would sure think that we should look at another way. It took us a long time to get that money put in there. And in one fell swoop, we're going to take $60 million out to pay for, I think we need to look at other ways. And I don't know what those are. I don't work for the IID, but I've never seen where you take all your savings account and throw it into the budget in 1 year and hope and pray something happens next year. From me, I'm very concerned at the way we came to make this budget balance. Thank you.
Mr. Weber?
Well, I mean, I understand the concern, but I don't mean to be argumentative, but we're not taking, I mean, the proposal is not to take all the savings out. It looks like it was put in here specifically for a purpose. This is not a capital account, so it's not like we're taking money out of the only savings that is there, effectively called savings. So, I mean, I kind of disagree with that comment that was just made.
Well, that's a correct representation, and I just would like to reiterate that the department has not only been looking at, but has actually been implementing other cost reduction measures over the last 5 subsequent years. So we are not just looking at an open checkbook. We're actually looking to see where we can reduce costs or become a more efficient organization.
But if I can as well, I tend to agree with the gentleman from El Centro. With the increase in this RPS cost coming up, and we know that's going to be coming up, and it'll be coming up soon, and the cost is going to go up substantially. So if we're spending, almost $60 million of this now, are we going to be hit much harder in a couple of years from now because we've used those funds now? I know earlier we talked about raising this 1 penny for the new rate, and what that would do for infrastructure and debt service for you. But I'm concerned with the cost of RPS coming at us real quickly in the future, and then if the state in all its I won't say wisdom, but in the state and its direction tends to increase the requirement for the RPS, thus the cost will increase substantially again from that. So I do agree with the gentleman from El Centro that we need to be mindful of where this cost of RPS is going and the use of these funds for that in the future.
Right, and again, that's a good point. Very briefly, many utilities that are out there have already had subsequent annual increases to their rates to cover the cost of the renewable portfolio standards. So we're actually pretty pleased that we've been able to mitigate the cost to the extent that we have been able to do so far. And as I said, we're going to continue to look at those measures to see what we can do.
Any other questions from Coachella Valley? Comment from Mr. Weber?
Generally, I understand. I think the process that we're going through here is to, and my understanding of the ECAC is to provide recommendations to the board. And I think based on the staff report, you're seeking that recommendation. I've got a little bit of a problem with the process that we're going through on this, just in that I know in my bill, from my circuit that I got in my bill, we're talking about having the rate hearings. We had one rate hearing down in Imperial, and then we have a rate hearing tomorrow up here. So the Coachella Valley customers haven't had a chance to comment at the rate hearing. And it worries me a little bit just by a process kind of that we're going through, is that to me the purpose of having a public hearing is to provide public comment and input prior to decisions being made. And it seems like it's a little bit ahead, that we should hopefully have had the hearing prior to the ECAC being asked to do a recommendation to the board, because it would be beneficial for the ECAC, especially here in Coachella, to hear from the Coachella Valley residents, or at least give them a forum to voice their comments. So when I was kind of looking at digging in, and I know kind of being the new guy, I'm talking a little bit too much, maybe being the new guy, but it just again, I think the hearing needs to occur before we actually go forward and give a recommendation.
To your point, something I didn't lay out in the memo, I didn't think to lay it out in the memo, the second public hearing is in fact here tomorrow night, or tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, as you indicated, and we are not actually taking this to the board for a vote until the meeting of the 12th. So that would allow the committees potentially some time to see what kind of feedback comes out of the meeting, and then I don't know if you'd avail yourself to a special meeting or correspondences to make a determination how do you like to proceed.
Time is of the essence, obviously, because if you were based on your projections, the April 1 is when you were hoping so it would fit with the plan that you've developed.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you. That's my comment.
Ms. Ainsworth, would you inform us if there were any significant comments made in the last rate hearing?
The only two members from the public who got up and spoke were actually Mr. Perez, and I'm sorry, is it Mr. Hernandez who's sitting to the right of him? Other than that, we really didn't have any other comments from the public. The hearing wasn't actually very well attended. There weren't a lot of people there from the public.
And the two comments were relative to what?
Mr. Perez talked about the fact that he was glad that we were taking a look at doing this as opposed to implementing a base rate increase. He was not in favor of a base rate increase, as he's also discussed during prior discussions that we've had on the issue. And Mr. Hernandez, I believe, was saying that he didn't, I think the gist that I got from it was he didn't really understand the change and understand some of the language that we were talking about. So I wanted to make sure that I went over some of the definitions and the formula and those types of things tonight for that purpose. And if I misrepresented either of you gentlemen, please speak up.
Oh, I still don't understand it. And basically what I said was that the people that I've talked to don't want a rate increase. They want efficiency, they want a balanced budget, but they don't want to continue raising rates, and I think that was my point. But I do agree that the formula is obsolete. I do agree that the overcharges should be obsolete. So I do agree with that part of it, but what's coming? That's what I'm worried about.
Thank you. Are there any additional comments? Okay. Staff is asking the ECAC to recommend to the Board of Directors to approve the elimination of the ECA cost component credit of 0.99 cents per kilowatt hour sold from the ECA rate schedule formula.
I'll make that motion.
I'll
make that motion if you're asking for a motion.
Okay, Mr. Hernandez. Vice Chairwoman Gomez,
Yes.
is there anyone seconding in Imperial County?
Mr. Pettis will second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second by the Imperial County members. Is there any further discussion, Mr. Weber?
Just want to reiterate that I just think from a procedural standpoint, we've got the cart before the horse, and I would urge the other members to not pass this proposal and make sure that we act in the advisory capacity that I think that we're supposed to for the board, and have a hearing first, and then weigh in on the comments that are made in that hearing. Granted, there might be few to none in La Quinta, because I think La Quinta is pretty happy with the way things are going generally, but I just think there's a procedural issue here that worries me.
Okay, no further questions or comments. All those in favor? Imperial County, Ms. Gomez, would you please let me know?
Who's
For the
in
motion.
favor of the motion?
Aye.
3 ayes.
She's doing it.
Ms. Ramos,
Vice Chair Gomez, what do we have in Imperial?
We have 3 ayes.
Okay, all those in favor in Coachella Valley?
Abstain.
Aye.
Would you please raise your hand so we can count? 3 ayes, 1 abstention.
Second abstention.
2 abstentions. Ms. Gomez, how many opposed do you have in Imperial County? Oh, Marion, help me out, do the math.
Abstain?
You have 6 ayes, 2 abstentions. How many members present?
We have 7 members present. We had 3 ayes. 1, 2, Mr. Anderson. Aye, nay, abstain, and 4 abstentions. 3 ayes and 4 abstentions.
Of the 15 members present, we have 6 ayes.
Okay, so the motion fails. Okay, and at this point, we'd like the comments made to be directed to the Board of Directors, that it was our hope that this item would have come after the last rate hearing here in the Coachella Valley, that seemed to be a concern, at least from the Coachella Valley side. And in addition to that, there were concerns expressed about our future. You know, can we really sit here and make these decisions today knowing that our future renewable portfolio standards may increase, or not having a full picture of what's going to happen after we deplete the existing funds? So those are the concerns that were expressed today. And if you would share that with the Board of Directors, we look to their guidance. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Ainsworth, for your report. Moving on to item number 7, we have open access transmission tariff. Ms. Asbury.
I thank the committee for the latitude to appear and present this to you from the El Centro facilities this evening. Jamie Asbury, Officer, IAD Interconnect Transmission Contract Section. I'm here to discuss the RFP number 943, which IAD issued to solicit proposals from qualified engineering firms for engineering studies required under IAD's open access transmission tariff. Slide 1, please. The tariff is the process that defines how generators achieve interconnection to the IAD system, and it also defines how you achieve transmission service from IAD. It also sets forth the process by which IAD deals with generators interconnecting to balancing authorities outside of the IAD system but impacting IAD. The OAT defines the process for interconnection and the studies required, and those studies for all purposes are system impact studies to determine the impact of the generation or transmission service on the reliability of the IAD system. And then we do a facility study to identify what mitigations in terms of infrastructure is required to reliably interconnect or address impacts from generation. We do sensitivity analyses, and there are times in the interconnection process when projects either need to up or downsize, or they want to change out transformer, there are impedance differences. So we look at them from a sensitivity perspective, then the affected system analysis, and then sometimes we have other engineering studies that are required. Sometimes we're required to take a look at what losses are on the system. There are a number of sort of catch-all, and that's the other engineering studies category. Next slide, please. IAD has, as we're all aware, a vast amount of renewable resource potential, and because of that renewable resource potential, the number of studies continues to increase. We've seen an exponential increase over the past several years, and we always keep thinking that it'll slow down eventually, and we're not seeing that. We just keep seeing more interest in the Imperial Valley, which is a good thing. We want to see development occur. But the tariff sets forth, again, the time frames for the studies that we have to complete, and we have to provide them to developers. And staff resources are strained very, very thinly because of the number of requests that we receive and the variety of requests that we're receiving. The studies are funded 100% by developers seeking whatever product from IAD they're looking for, interconnection, transmission service, or an identification of how they're impacting us as an affected system when they're interconnecting outside of IAD proper system. We issued RFP 943 to obtain responses from a pool of qualified engineering firms to provide staff support so that we can provide the required studies and meet our timelines under the tariff. Next slide, please. We received 16 responses to the RFP, and we realized that during the initial evaluation that because IAD used certain nomenclature and individual companies didn't identify certain job functions by the same term, we were not getting an apples-to-apples comparison with respect to how costs on these RFPs were being addressed. So we really couldn't make a cost comparison appropriately. So what staff did was, through contract administration, we sent out a request for pricing from every one of those 16 vendors based on 5 generic study plans like we would normally issue. And we advised these vendors that this was the cost comparison that their bid would be evaluated on. They complied with that request, and an evaluation of the pricing component was based on consistent information from every vendor, and that pricing comparison was performed by contract administration. Next slide, please. This is the evaluation protocol, and I apologize, it's very, very small, but I was trying to get it all in there. The executive summary portion of the response had 5 points. The project organization, key personnel experience, and technical competency was 15 points. The proposed method by which they would accomplish the work was a 25-point response. The cost proposal was 40%. A local vendor received a 5-point preference. And I should point out to the committee, there were no local vendors. This is all from outside of the valley. And then any exception to contractual arrangements was a 10-point deduction for a total maximum of 100 points. Next slide, please. This, staff recommended award to the top 6 ranked vendors, and the recommendation was reviewed by the Oversight Committee on February 7th. They approved staff recommendation and authorized us to seek board approval. We did present it as an informational item to the board on the 19th. Action approving the award is sought at tomorrow's meeting. It is on the consent agenda. I do want to make the committee aware of that. Next slide, please. And staff recommended award to the following firms: Orion Technical Services, and this is not in order in which their points were counted. It's just in order that's orderly. Mitsubishi, Reliable Power Solutions, S&C Electric Company, Power Engineers, and TRC Solutions. Are there any questions at this point?
Vice Chair Gomez, do we have any questions in Imperial County?
No questions from El Centro.
Thank you. Do we have any questions in Coachella Valley? Mr. Bayard?
Jamie, is there a way of telling us? Sorry. Jamie, is there a way of telling us the scores for each of these organizations?
That
without too much
information
trouble?
is not released to me ever in the process. It's retained by contract administration and purchasing, so that there's no dissemination of information outside of the process. So I would assume that contract administration could provide that information to the committee if it's required.
Mr. Weber?
I just want to comment that it's nice to see that when you initially evaluated, you saw that there was some issues there, and you went back and did an additional request for pricing. I think that was an appropriate thing to do to make sure that you were getting that apples to apples, and that the price disparities were, or the issues were addressed, I guess.
Thank you. We wanted to be certain that everyone had the same opportunity, and we wanted to make certain that at the end of the day, these are customer-funded studies, and we wanted to make certain that our customers were well served.
Right. And then following up on the customer service side of it, while I understand that the local vendors couldn't have been, that there were no local vendors, it'd be nice to kind of continue to nudge that and encourage local vendors and encourage those jobs to be created, here and to stay in this location. And I would suggest that maybe the scoring for the local vendors, maximum points might be enhanced if procurement can take a look at that. It might make sense to do that in order to incentivize maybe some of these more national folks to start looking at our area, since we are going to have a lot of renewables and a lot of opportunities for, interconnections. Thank you.
Are there any further questions in La Quinta? All right, this is, thank you very much, Mrs. Asbury. This is an information item only, so no action is necessary. We will move on to our next item, item number 8, generator interconnection agreement. Ms. Asbury.
Thank you. I'm here to present, this is sort of a unique concept for IID, and I'm going to walk through all sides of this project. This is the interconnection agreement for the Soul Orchard Community 1 LLC 7 megawatt San Diego State PV project. Try saying that without taking a breath. Next slide, please. The interconnection request for this project was submitted to IID in February of 2012. It will be interconnecting to the IID system via a tap to a 34.5 kV line adjacent to the San Diego State facility in Brawley. This project is a community solar concept, which means that IID is the off-taker of the energy, but customers are going to be allowed to participate in or opt into utilizing power from this project. I kind of look at it as a distributed generation by proxy sort of arrangement, in that I don't have a solar facility or a solar rooftop on my home, but I could participate in this community solar project and receive sort of the same green effect from it. It would, sort of a virtual participation in this. So this is through a PPA process through the IID, but projects or customers can choose to participate so that they're being served with essentially green energy. The project was serially analyzed in the normal course. We looked at it for what impacts it would have on the reliability of the grid, and we defined the infrastructure required to mitigate those impacts. The total interconnection costs for the project are $1.256 million. Next slide, please. We're using IID's pro forma interconnection agreement that is set out in our open access transmission tariff, although this project was not processed under the tariff. We are using that agreement as a model only so that there's a level of consistency in the way that generators are interconnected to our system. They have a very aggressive in-service date. They would like to be online by the end of this year. It's more likely first quarter of next year. They desire to assume responsibility for procurement to drive the schedule. They won't be eligible for transmission rate credits. This project was not processed through the tariff. In the event, this is a conceptual presentation and an informational presentation to the ECAC with respect to this project. We have not finalized the interconnection agreement. There are some details that we are still working out. We are going to ask that the developer waive any liquidated damages if they're going to drive the schedule, and IID has no control over that. We don't want to be open or have our ratepayers exposed to that liability. This slide shows the site. It's very small, but the little box to the left is the facility. The one on the right is San Diego State in Brawley. Next slide, please.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
In the prior page, you said that customers could participate. For example, if you want to participate, how are you going to transmit the power to me from Brawley?
You don't. It's a virtual. It'll just be an adjustment on your billing, so they will inject into the system. You know, electrons don't know whether they're green or brown or what color they are, so it'll be just it'll basically be a paper scheduling sort of issue, and that's the way we address it. But Mr. Perez, your energy for your home would then be green, that you subscribed to that project, so your kilowatt consumption would be
taken off from that,
essentially be green.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I wanted to ask, that unit that you're talking about, wasn't there some solar panels already installed in there around San Diego State facility? Or is this new?
There may be some distributed generation where they're offsetting their own load, and that's entirely possible. This is a little different situation because this is more of a it's not a distributed generation process proper because a PPA is involved, but I'll go into that in just a little bit. But there may be panels there where they're offsetting their own load. That's another section of IIT. That part I don't know. Next slide, please. I think I missed a slide. What I wanted to make sure that on slide 3, please, could you go back, Marion? Thank you. Uh-oh, something's missing. There is a separate power purchase agreement I mentioned because San Diego State wanted and the developer wanted to do this. Load serving responsibility within our service territory is IID's right. In order, I couldn't install a merchant facility and then solicit different people in the valley and ask to be their load serving entity. That right and obligation belongs to the IID. So that we could accommodate this, a community solar concept, there had to be an off-taker for the energy. So IID had to enter into a power purchase agreement with the developer of these facilities. Under the provisions of that PPA, which was negotiated under a different energy manager and by a different section of the IID, the interconnection costs for this project were capped at $600,000. So anything over the $600,000 is going to be borne or repaid by IID to the developer or to the PPA holder over a period of 5 years and equal annual installments that bear interest at 2%. And I wanted to make sure that the ECAC was aware of that because it's a two-part sort of function. I'm in charge of the interconnection component of this. The PPA is by a different section of IID, but it was, I believe San Diego State was involved and they're looking to begin the process by which, as Mr. Weber suggested, we begin to cultivate engineering and careers that will support the renewable industry in the valley. And I think that was one of the drivers that sort of led the district to go forward in this manner. And I believe Mr. Stills.
Jamie, let me address that issue for
Sure.
a second. Because when I looked at this, I couldn't understand why my predecessor had actually capped this cost when the costs were much higher. I have directed my current staff that all risk of interconnection goes through the developer from this point forward. I don't want to cap those costs. Those interconnection costs will be borne by the developer as he puts his development in. So I can't explain why that cap is there, but what I can say is unless I have board directive, I won't be capping them in the future.
But that cap was approved by the board, correct, in the contract?
Well, it was approved by the board in the contract, but I don't think they had developed the interconnection costs or they had very good estimates on that. And at some point, you have to push that risk to the developer for that interconnection cost, and his price is going to reflect that risk. But that is the way it's normally done. In the future, my staff has already been directed that that's the way it will be done.
Okay. Does that conclude the report?
I did want to let the committee know that we're in the final negotiations for the interconnection agreement, and given their aggressive in-service date, it'll likely go to the board for approval at the April 2nd meeting. I would be happy to provide an update with respect to the board's action at the ECAC meeting thereafter, if that works for the committee.
Thank you. Vice Chairwoman Gomez, do you have any questions in Imperial County?
Yes, Mr. Hernandez?
Yeah, I have a question. Who's going to determine the customers in this project? Soul Orchard or the IID?
It's my understanding that there is an obligation on the part of San Diego State to market, and I believe that market the concept. It's not online and generating yet, so we have, I don't know what the subscription is or what the mechanism is, but it's my understanding that they have some obligation to market the energy from this and the green attributes of the project. And I believe that through our energy and strategic marketing group of IID, they'll also be addressing ways that they can make customers aware that this is actually an option that they can opt for their power consumption.
So we are looking at lower costs if they go this way. Lower energy costs for the customers who participate in this project.
I can't make that representation. I'm not sure. I suspect that the cost is not lower. I suspect it is greater because it's a renewable project. I don't know that. I'm not involved in the PPA negotiations, so I don't know the pricing on that.
Okay, and how many projects does this make now for Soul Orchard in our district?
With respect to interconnection?
How many projects do they have?
I can talk openly about projects that have been publicly addressed. To the extent they have other projects in the interconnection process, I can't address that.
How many publicly?
2, this
Just
one
2.
and one other. And I don't know on the PPA side, that's not my area of responsibility.
That's all the questions I have.
Ms. Gomez, are there any further questions?
No additional questions from El Centro.
Okay, do we have any questions in Coachella Valley? We have no further questions here. Thank you, Ms. Asbury. Again, this is an informational item only. We look forward to future updates. Thank you for the presentation. Moving on to item number 9, PBC Subcommittee Appointment. There is no staff report on this item. Ms. Champion, would you like to speak?
With the departure of Mr. Dilda McFadden on the ECAC, we have a vacancy in the Public Benefits Subcommittee in the Imperial Valley. And I have reached out to a few members to see if anyone would be interested. Mr. John Hernandez has expressed interest. If there are any others, please let us know.
Vice Chair Gomez, are there any other volunteers?
No, not that I see anybody coming forward. So that would be Mr.
So
Hernandez.
by unanimous.
And it's an appointment by the chair.
Oh, it's
to
an appointment
make
by
the
the chair, Mr. Hernandez. Well, thank you, Mr. Hernandez, for stepping forward and being a part of this very important subcommittee. We look forward to your representation, representing the Imperial Valley and working with the Coachella Valley representatives on the subcommittee. If there be no objection, I will make that appointment. Thank you. Item number, why does it say number 1 again?
Number 10.
It's a mistake.
Because it's a mistake. Coordinators report, Ms. Champion.
Good evening, Marion Champion, ECAC Coordinator. I only have 2 updates for you this evening. The first being that Form 700s are due. If you haven't already dropped them off, please send me them in the mail, or you can arrange to drop them off at a facility. Just send me an email, let me know where you'd like to drop it off. Also, if you look in your packets, you will see that there is an absence report in there as well.
Thank you. And you've spoken with all the new committee members to make sure they understand the 700 responsibility. Thank you. Mr. Weber, you have a question?
Comment and maybe a motion, if I can. I had checked with the coordinator and had some conversations via email. I know that, well, basically this is in regards to the absences, and I guess what I'd like to do is make a motion to recommend to the board an excused absence for Miss Patricia Soleil. I've been in contact with her. I know she's had a family issue, actually a death in the family that's prevented her from participating, and I was concerned that someone with her active past and involvement and commitment, that I didn't want her to be subject to any issues in regards to the number of meetings missed within a time period. And just as after making that motion, I guess as a point of clarification, I did have a conversation via email with Ms. Champion regarding it, and I think the bylaws are a little bit unclear as to whether that that 5 month is a rolling window of a year, or if it's a calendar year or a fiscal year. And so I better to be safe than sorry is kind of the avenue that I'm going at after, because I think Ms. Soleil is a good member of this committee from what I'd seen in the past. And so I'd like to make that motion as a recommendation to the board.
Thank you. I don't think there'd be any objection with us recommending an excused absence in light of Ms. Soleil's family tragedy. So if there be no objection from the committee members, we'll move that forward. I do have a question, though. When do our terms begin? Are they on the January calendar cycle, or because our calendar goes from February to February?
The
rolls.
attendance recap goes 12 months, but the appointments vary each year starting in January.
But we're usually all appointed on the month of January unless it's a midterm. Okay.
Technically, in a perfect world, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Champion. Moving on to item number 11, department update. Mr. Stills.
Yes, Madam Chairman, Carl Stills, Energy Manager. Only 2 items today. The first item I would like to talk to you is I've had a request by the General Manager's office. They obviously like the work that Marion Champion is doing, and they want to increase her role with some of the tasks that they have from the GM's position. So we are going to change coordinators, and the Marion is going to move on to bigger and better things, working at the GM's office, and Rosa Marie Gonzalez is going to do 2 things for us. One, she's going to help coordinate this committee. 2, she's moving into an economic development support for both Coachella and Imperial Valleys. So my intention is to look at economic development as an investment rather than an expense, and to support it to a greater extent. And I can't think of a better person than Rosa Maria to head that up for me. So anyhow, we will be transitioning coordinators. That will be part of her role to step into Marion to free her up to do the things that the GM wants her to do. So I just wanted to notify the committee of that. The second thing is, and I think some of you have already heard about the Imperial Valley Renewable Summit that is occurring next week from the 13th through the 15th. We have a couple members here that have requested tickets to that. We've reserved those. What I'm here to do is to invite the rest of you, if you aren't familiar with that Renewable Summit, if you would like to attend that, then we will go ahead and purchase tickets for that. So if you would like to attend that, please contact either Rosa Maria, probably from this point forward, and we'll go ahead and make the purchase of the tickets for you. We think that your involvement in there, you're going to get to see some of the things that we see. It's probably not a bad idea.
So it's a 3-day event?
It starts on the 13th through the 15th. You can go to IVEDC online and Google that and go to their website, and you'll be able to see the published agenda, who's speaking, who's what time frame, what for all 3 days.
Okay.
Okay, so what I do say, if you do want to go, let us know. We'll have to get those tickets.
Thank you. Are there any questions of Mr. Stills? Vice Chair Gomez, do we have any questions in Imperial County?
Any questions? No questions from El Centro.
Thank you very much. Moving on to item 10, 11, 12, 13, I think. Member comments. Vice Chair Gomez, do we have any member comments in Imperial County?
Comments? None at this point.
Do we have
no
any member
comments.
comments in Coachella? Okay. Do we have any in Coachella Valley? Councilmember Osborne?
Thank you. The packet for today,
The packet for today, the City of La Quinta downloaded this for me last week. Unfortunately, though, the one in the mail I got today, so I don't know. I'm glad staff at City Hall was able to get it to me last week, but in the future, if they're not able to, I don't know if we can mail those a little bit earlier so we don't get them the day of the meeting. But if that's possible, appreciate it.
Yeah, I usually don't receive mine till the Friday after the meeting, so I don't know when they're being mailed.
That's why I got it
Ms.
electronically.
Ms. Broughton?
I've just spent, as has Loopy, the last 10 days at the Riverside County Fair and National Date Festival. I'd like to thank the Imperial Irrigation District for their participation and their support. It was good to see them in the community, being part of the community, and interacting in a very positive way. It took a lot of effort from a lot of people, and I thank you so much.
Mr. Bayard?
What can I say? I'm mad at Carl for promoting Marion, but I'm happy for Marion. She's the reason I joined this committee. God, I don't know why, but I guess it was her. Yeah, she's the one to blame. And I'm sorry to see her go. I'm glad she's moving up. Just not too high.
I will tell you that I was served her work here. I'm really impressed.
Any other comments from Coachella Valley? I too want to thank Marion. It's been great working you for 8 years. Well, not only on the IID, but in general. And we welcome Rosa Maria. She's been with us before. She subbed a few times before Marion took over the reins.
Excuse me.
We look forward to working with you. Mr. Perez, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes. The new appointee, is she there?
Yes, she is. Rosa Maria, would you come up forward and
Yeah,
introduce
I'd
yourself
like to see her
everyone,
face.
because there are some members that don't know who you are. Though they may have seen you in Imperial County. She's been around.
Hello, everyone. I
can't see her.
am Rosa Maria Gonzalez.
Oh, okay.
I am Rosa Maria Gonzalez. I am the Superintendent of Community Relations. I report, I guess now directly to Carl. I am a longtime IID employee, and I've been involved in, numerous facets of the organization, including communications and most recently transmission planning. And I'm looking forward to working with you all. And I will be providing you with my contact information when this meeting closes so that you may be able to contact me should you need anything. Thank you.
Thank you. We look forward to working with you. And Marion, please come back and visit us sometimes. If there be no further member comments, our next meeting is April 8th, 2013, El Centro, 6 p.m. I guess staff will be in El Centro next meeting. And if there be no objection, we will stand adjourned. And I want everyone to take note, it is before 8 p.m. Good night.